Welcome to Friends at the End podcast with Sorcha a program dedicated to end-of-life choices, dignity in dying and personal autonomy, as well as the debate on assisted dying legislation, among other themes. The Friends at the End podcast aims to bring in a variety of voices, from testimonials to parliamentarians, lawmakers, philosophers, and health professionals. Today we welcome Professor Ben Colburn. A former research fellow at Corpus Christi College, Professor Colburn has taught political philosophy at the University of Glasgow since 2010. His research takes special focus on the nature and value of individual autonomy, which is reflected, among other things, in his work on assisted dying legislation. Sharing our values and goals, Ben is a tremendous addition to Friends at the End as our newest patron. Welcome, Professor Colburn, to episode 2 of the Friends at the End podcast.
Welcome, Ben, and thank you for coming to the podcast. How have you been?
Very well, thank you, Sorcha. Enjoying the lovely sunshine in Edinburgh this morning.
I know, it's a lovely day today. So, Ben, you're one of Fate's newest patrons. Could you tell us a bit about that and what drove you to join Friends at the End?
Well, I've talked with people involved in Friends at the End for a few years now, as I've been interested in these questions about sort of end-of-life choices. The original way I formed contact with the organisation was that I was invited to join the cross-party group in the Scottish Parliament looking at some of these issues. That group was sponsored by Friends at the End, of course, and by its former chief executive, Amanda Ward, who I think you've had on a previous episode of the podcast, haven't you?
Yes, we did, yeah.
Anyway, so I got involved because this is something I care about and something where I think my philosophical expertise might be able to contribute something to our collective conversation about this important issue. And I think that I was really honoured and excited to get the invitation to be a patron. I've never been a patron of anything before, but I guess that maybe what that recognises is that there's a role for us especially to have a sort of research-led approach to these questions around end of life. And I think that as somebody with experience both of kind of core moral philosophy and the central ethical issues that inform why we're moving towards this kind of change, one hopes, but also with experience of social science research and thinking about how to connect ethical reasoning with practical policy, I think I've got quite a good skill set to be able to dig into these ideas for the organisation.
And we're very happy to have you. So what's your take on the moment we're experiencing around the world with more and more jurisdictions allowing assisted dying and with increasing support from the public?
Well, I think that after a period of time when people have not talked about death very much, where death has been taboo in lots of societies, I think that's sort of shifting. I think we've seen some wonderful books published recently by people like Atul Gawande and Catherine Mannix, which have sort of encouraged people to have frank and open conversations about the process of death and dying. And I think one of the consequences that that's had, as well as people's experience of relatives and friends of theirs dying, we're in an increasingly ageing society, of course, that's forced a kind of reevaluation where people have thought, look, is this assumption that people should just left be to their own devices, is that assumption something we should hold on to? So I think that we've seen some jurisdictions which have shifted more in a kind of direction of liberalisation as a result of that kind of process. And of course you end up with a snowball effect, because I think a lot of people's opposition to assisted dying is based on fears and speculations about what might happen if we were to allow it. And of course now we don't really need to speculate about that, because people can look at jurisdictions like the Netherlands or Oregon or Australia now, Canada and so on, and they can see that the real lived experience of assisted dying laws is that they do empower people as well as protecting them. And that means that demand kind of grows as people's fears get reassured by looking at that experience. So I think that's what we're seeing. We're seeing a sort of tipping point whereby the greater focus on having frank conversations with each other about death and dying on the one hand, and experience of how assisted dying laws function in reality is creating greater and greater demand across the world for it.
Yeah. So can you tell us a bit more about your previous work on assisted dying, and what motivated you to get involved and why you think it's important for society?
Absolutely. I mean, I think a couple of things. On the academic front, I had an invitation to write a chapter for a book about 8 years ago. The editor of that book got in contact with me because they were aware of my previous work on individual autonomy, and they were editing a book with people with expertise in quite a lot of different topics, thinking about assisted dying, and I was the one that they wanted to sort of think about autonomy and how it applied to this topic. And at that stage, I hadn't really done any academic work on the matter since I was an undergraduate, basically. Assisted dying is one of those standard topics for first-year philosophy students, but I hadn't really thought about it seriously since then. And actually, that first chapter that I wrote was one that was quite sceptical, because it raised some problems for assisted dying legislation. My worry was that if people feel as though an assisted death is the only reasonable option that they have in a particular situation, then there are worries about whether the choices people make in that context are genuinely voluntary. And in that paper, I kind of sketched out ways that we might create a sort of supportive context to ensure that condition held. So academically, that's what got me into it. And of course, as is always the way, I found the questions exciting, interesting, kind of troubling, but also really important. And it stood me in good stead once the drive to a new legislative process started up here in Scotland. Also, I think this is what happens to people when they're at my kind of stage in life. A lot of my older relatives and family friends have been approaching the end of their lives, and I've been trying to have conversations with them about what they hope for and what their fears are. And that really impressed on me the urgency of trying to change things so that they didn't feel quite as powerless as many of them feel at the moment when they contemplate physical or mental decline over the next couple of decades.
You mentioned being sceptical previously. At what point did you change your mind? Was it more the personal experiences that you had?
No, actually, because I think that in this respect, I think I've taken a slightly different path through these issues to many people. I think lots of people are really motivated to think about assisted dying because of those personal experiences or the striking anecdotes that they hear. I'm a little bit worried, just as a matter of general method, about relying too much on striking anecdotes on one or other side of this particular debate, because I think that it's possible to raise kind of hair-raising stories on both sides, and I'm not sure whether we make much progress by focusing on those individual cases. No, for me, it was just thinking through the issues. Yeah. I looked at it and I thought, well, there's a kind of danger here, but there's also a presumption, in my view, in favour of individual autonomy. So that set me a kind of challenge, didn't it? The question is, look, can I find a way of squaring my general presumption in favour of allowing people control over their own lives, which one might think leads to an assumption that people ought to have control over the timing and manner of their death as well. Can I hold on to that and find a way of reassuring myself about the various dangers that initially worried me quite significantly? And I think that I became persuaded that you could deal with those. I think the worries I originally had about the voluntariness of these decisions, I think, was assuaged by the idea that actually assisted dying is always going to be something that we implement in a social context. And my work with palliative care organisations made me realise that there's no conflict between palliative care and offering assisted dying. In fact, there's some reason to think that support for both of these measures goes hand in hand in quite a synergetic sort of way. So I came to think that actually the worries that I'd had were not sufficient to overcome the very important presumption that you want to give people control over the important things that happen to them.
So as a teacher of political philosophy, can you tell us a bit about why you think that previous efforts to bring forward this legislation have failed despite increasing support from the public?
Absolutely. I think one thing to say is I don't want to be too down on the MSPs who have voted about this in the past. I think that as a member of the public myself, it's kind of easy to respond to surveys and polls and say, yeah, absolutely, I think this should happen. But I think that if you're actually legislating for these types of changes, I understand that it's pretty weighty. I dare say that if you were in that position, you'd feel quite a strong feeling of personal responsibility to make sure you got it right. So I think a certain amount of caution amongst our legislators is understandable, even though actually I think they've made the wrong decision when they voted this down in previous attempts. I think the central problem, though, is that although there's very wide public support about the general principles here, the previous attempts to create legislation on this topic have jumped very, very quickly to kind of talking about specifics, and in particular framing the discussion just in terms of responding to fears and putting in safeguards. Now, the problem with doing that is that it means that you kind of miss out the point where you build a coalition, a kind of overlapping consensus amongst legislators and amongst the public over the core principles that you're trying to hold on to with the legislation. Of course, the details of safeguards matters tremendously, but it matters that those are suffused by a shared understanding of the principles that underlie it. When you don't have that happen, what happens is that people start looking at the details of proposals, and everybody who looks at it has a different fear in their head. They have what people tend to do is they have some sort of scenario in their mind, which is a person, I guess, that they were afraid of dying in certain circumstances, who they think wouldn't be protected. And that one fear, which could be really real, but very idiosyncratic and maybe something that wouldn't ever actually obtain, it captures their imagination basically, such that they worry that unless something is put into the legislation to specifically respond to that worry, that it's going to not be it's not going to be justifiable. Now, I've just described that in terms of a thought process for a single person. Now replicate that for all of the MSPs who are involved in deciding on this type of thing at Holyrood, or all of the MPs and members of the House of Lords who decide on it at Westminster, or think about it for all of the thousands, maybe the hundreds of thousands of people who care about this in a place like Scotland. You end up with the legislation dying the death of 1,000 cuts, because everybody has their own fear, which makes them hold back from it. Now, the way to deal with that, I think, is to spend a bit more time firstly gathering the evidence so that you can say, sure, these fears are real. It matters to address them properly. But we don't have to speculate. We can look at the evidence and the experience from jurisdictions where this has been implemented. And a lot of that evidence, I think, certainly the evidence that I've looked at, it shows that those fears, although sincere and understandable, are not borne out by the reality of assisted dying laws. And the other thing is to focus on the core principles, the things like respect for individual autonomy that I think is at the core of it, or recognising the importance that people shouldn't undergo terrible suffering if they want to be free of it.
So what's your feeling about where we are as a society when it comes to personal autonomy? Do you think we're in an era where we expect to be freer and more autonomous when it comes to decision making? Or are we in a time where people expect greater protection from companies and governments, even if it comes at the expense of limiting our options?
That's the sort of question that when you ask a political philosopher, inevitably they say, it's complicated. So Let me just say it's complicated.
Yeah.
And it's complicated for a couple of reasons. I think one of them is that individual autonomy, I think of that as an ideal of self-authorship. So the autonomous agent is somebody who decides for herself what is valuable and lives her life in accordance with that decision. It's a way in which you can be the person who shapes your life and takes responsibility for the course it takes. That's not quite the same thing as freedom, and it's not quite the same thing as freedom of choice. In particular, there might be ways in which policy or structures might create more freedom for you, but they do it in a way which undermines your autonomy, because that freedom is not there's no way of you making use of that freedom in a way that increases the extent to which you're the author of your life. So I think that what does that mean in terms of your question? Well, you sort of set it up as a kind of dichotomy between being more autonomous and making more choices on the one hand, and having kind of restrictions and protections on the other hand. And I think that actually if we focus on autonomy rather than freedom, then we see that these two things come together, that there can be pieces of legislation that we can implement that might restrict people's freedom of choice in certain respects, which nevertheless enhance their autonomy. Now, that's a kind of general point. How does this apply to assisted dying in particular? Well, I think that one of the things to recognise about the proposals to bring in assisted dying laws is that actually those are a kind of protection that is being brought in. I mean, people are making end-of-life choices already all the time. And the problem at the moment is that because assisted dying is not legal, the decisions about those end-of-life decisions those end-of-life decisions are happening in a way that is unregulated, not transparent. Doctors who are involved in it have to keep pretty quiet because of the danger of prosecution. The individuals concerned are not able to have kind of open and frank conversations about it. I think that actually regulating these decisions, bringing them into the open by making this process legal, but also putting down quite stringent requirements for what people can and can't do, what kind of evidence is required, what type of diagnosis unlocks this option for you and so on, is actually a way of enhancing people's autonomy by putting the choices that they make in a sort of transparent structure rather than just leaving it up to sort of people making these decisions sort of under the surface, so to speak, or behind closed doors.
Yeah. So some of the strongest opposition to assisted dying has come from religious groups. And Pope Francis recently said, physician-assisted suicide is part of a throwaway culture that offers a false compassion and treats a human person as a problem. The devaluation of human life seems to be a common argument against assisted dying. What would be your response to that?
Well, let me say two things. The first is that I deeply respect people who oppose assisted dying for themselves from a religious perspective. It's worth noting that not all religious people oppose assisted dying. We know, for example, that George Carey, past Archbishop of Canterbury, has been quite a powerful advocate for assisted dying laws precisely because he thinks that's what follows from his Christian beliefs. But it's clear that lots of religious people take a different view, Pope Francis included. The question for us as a society is not straightforward, though, when we think about how Scotland is a political community of people with different faiths and people with no faith at all. I think that we don't want sort of the options for everybody to be settled by the religious convictions of a few people where those religious convictions aren't shared by all people. So I think the answer in one sense to this type of objection is, sure, you don't want assisted dying for you. That's fine. But the religious convictions of one person are not a reason to deny choice to another person. I think, of course, you could have worries along those lines which aren't religiously based. So somebody who is an atheist or a humanist or an agnostic could agree that they worry about human life being devalued. But I guess I've never really understood the connection between allowing people some manner of control over the time and the manner of their death as being something that has that kind of devaluing effect. For me, it goes back to the value of individual autonomy. I think what's valuable about life is this amazing capacity we have for being able to shape it actively and live it in accordance with our values. I think that picks out lots of what's valuable and important about life. But I think it also tells us that actually the deep well springs of those values tell us that sometimes that life comes to an end, and that it might be an important way of recognizing the value of life to allow people to control that process if they wish to. Remember, one of the core metaphors for thinking about autonomy is as an ideal of self-authorship. That means one way of thinking about your life, if you're autonomous, is as a kind of narrative structure that you're creating, a story that you're writing almost. And it's a really important part of the value of a story that it comes to an end, that there's an ending to it of some sort.
So we're sitting here in sunny Leith, and we know that at Holyrood consultation is taking place on Liam MacArthur MSP's bill proposal on assisted dying. What's your take on the proposal? Do you think it goes far enough? And how would you encourage our audience to take an active part in this consultation process?
Well, I'm really excited that the proposal is being brought forward. I think that it has a good chance of passing. Actually, it feels like this is the moment when we might be able to get this progressive change in Scotland. I think the proposal is reasonable and sensible. I think it's been framed by taking into account some of the reasons that previous proposals have failed. That's both in terms of process, but also in terms of really listening to people's worries about protections and safeguards and making sure that those are brought in a robust way. The key thing, I think, is making sure that whatever change happens is legitimate. And legitimate both in the sense that it's justified, but also in the sense that it gives confidence to people, that it gives them an option that they want, but also that it assuages their fears. So I'm really encouraged to see how seriously people are taking the question of protection for people with disabilities or people with different types of cognitive degenerative conditions and so on here. The focus on terminal illness, I think, people with a terminal diagnosis, I think, is a really important part of that. Now, do they go far enough? I think it's important when we're thinking about this type of legislative process not to let the best be the enemy of the good. Mm-hmm. So I think that as I look at evidence from around the world, I think that there's an interesting case, a philosophical case and a legal case, to be made for extending assisted dying to people who don't have a terminal diagnosis. But that's not the proposal that's on the table here. And I think it's right to start with something that's incremental, partly because I think it's clear that that's where the greatest amount of support currently exists, certainly within Scotland, but also because I think there's nothing quite like experience for allowing a political community to decide what it wants its laws to be. And it gives people in Scotland the opportunity to experience assisted dying laws with respect to this comparatively limited group of people. And if the consensus amongst the voting public is that that's enough and that we don't want to go any further, then of course I respect that view on the part of my co-citizens, and that shows that that's where the natural sort of resting point for Scotland would lie. For what it's worth, my hunch is that actually as the process of assisted dying becomes demystified, as those fears that people might have about what it means get sort of reassured away by the experience of it actually operating, then I think that we will probably have further conversations where we ask each other, look, do we want to extend this option to other people as well? But that's something to have further down the line. I think that for now, these proposals do go far enough. But of course, I'm just one voice in this process. And one of the wonderful things about the legislative consultation is that people can have their own voice heard as part of it. And I know that it's tremendously important to Liam MacArthur, the MSP who's sponsoring the bill, but also the people who will be responsible for designing the specific legislation that comes forward, that as many people as possible have their voices heard in that. I think there are inevitably sort of pressure groups which push for their members to respond in particular ways to this type of consultation. But I think that having as wide a range of voices from as many parts of the Scottish political community as we can get is the way to get this right, both to design the right legislation and to make sure that it's sort of legitimate to people.
So we've covered quite a lot this morning, Ben. Is there anything else in particular a message you want to send to our listeners, perhaps?
I think what I've been thinking about mostly is, recently on this topic, is vulnerability and disability. Mm-hmm. Because I think that the arguments on the opposite side which move me and concern me the most are arguments from advocates for disabled rights who are worried that assisted dying will be a problem for people with disabilities. And I think that there are things about the nature of the current legislation which ought to be reassuring on that front. The fact that it's just for people with a terminal diagnosis is very important. Lots of people with disabilities won't be eligible for precisely that reason. But there's also a kind of philosophical point which I think it's important that all of us think about, which is how we want to respond to vulnerability. Because I think people are right that you want to have legislation which looks after the interests of people with vulnerabilities, people with different types of disability, for example. And I think the key thing that I've come to think is that the right approach for us to take to that kind of vulnerability is the way that we approach vulnerability elsewhere as well. In general, I think, correctly, the way we want to respond to vulnerability is by empowering people in the face of it. If you're vulnerable to changes in your work life, for example, or employment, we don't take away your choices. We want to empower you to make sort of more employment choices by education, by retraining if necessary. When we think about your vulnerability as a patient in hospital undertaking a risky operation, the way that we try to support you in that vulnerability is by informing you about what your options are and then treating your consent as authoritative about what happens to you. We don't take away your choice there. The central challenge with end-of-life choices, I think, is the question, well, why should we take a different approach there? Why is it that some people think that the right way to respond to people's vulnerability at end of life is to not empower people, to do the opposite, in fact, to take away their choices? And I think the conclusion I've come to is that there's no reason to treat those choices differently. That the best thing for us to do in that situation is to empower people. And that means respecting the choices of people who don't want an assisted death, making sure that we have a rich and active palliative care sector so that people can pursue that option instead. But if an assisted death is the right thing for somebody, if it's the right choice for them, then I think we have to offer it to them. And I think that's the kind of key thought that I've come to there. And the key thing that I want to say to people who are concerned about whether this type of change will adequately protect people with vulnerabilities, I think that we shouldn't be thinking in terms of protection so much as empowerment and respect. Mm-hmm. And I think that points in favour of legalisation.
Yeah. Thanks, Ben. It's been a really interesting discussion. Thank you very much for coming on our podcast.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's been great.